Tunisia, from Egypt. And so in this talk, I will try to sort of explain about at least one community, and that's the Iraqi Jewish community. So the Jewish community in Iraq numbered about 130,000 people before they arrived to Israel in the years 1949, 1951. And it was a very affluent community. I talked about them in my book. That's a plug, New Babylonians. We skipped the plug. But what is significant about this community is that it was one of the most Arabized communities, and all of them spoke at homes or with their neighbors a dialect of Arabic. But the Iraqi Jewish community was one of the most Arabized in the sense that its members knew the classical Arabic very well. They read Arabic, they wrote in Arabic. Some of the reasons for that was that in the 20th century, very much like in other communities across the world, Jews left the traditional Jewish neighborhoods, and as they entered the Iraqi middle classes, they lived together with Christians, with Muslims in Iraq. So the quote behind you is by a boy called David Nagar, or at the time Daoud Najjar, that spoke about the fact that he really liked Arabic. He liked the Quran, he liked the Arabic language, because they lived in a mixed neighborhood. And he used to listen to the muazzin, the man who called for prayer several times a day. And David's experience was actually similar to many Jews in Iraq. One of the reasons for that is that the Iraqi government stated and made it compelled by law to have Arabic civics, Arab history, and Arabic language taught in Jewish schools, even in private schools, as kind of a mean to connecting Jews to the state. So a lot of Jews, even Jews who went to private schools, and the Jewish community in Iraq had fabulous private schools, French and British, even these kids learn Arabic. Now, the community members were quite integrated into the elite. They were writers, they were journalists, many of them were merchants, members of the middle class. But the elites in Iraq were very fearful of Zionism. While there was support for the project among some who even invested in Palestine, the elites who wanted to show that they're part of the Iraqi state were very fearful that the development of the Zionist movement in Iraq would actually mark them as treacherous. So the petition behind me during the 1930s is a petition that was signed by the leaders of the Jewish community, showing their sympathy or their empathy with the struggle of the Palestinians in what was then mandatory Palestine. The community also had a small but significant Zionist movement. And this movement started to operate after 1941, where there were huge sectarian riots called the Farhud, after the failure of a pro-German coup during which 180 Jews were killed in Baghdad. But it escalates, or it becomes quite important in the late 1940s, where Jews become sort of pawns in the Arab-Israeli conflict. On the one hand, Israel very much wants them to come. On the other hand, there's a right-wing campaign in Iraq to kind of push them out, saying that every Jew is a treacherous Zionist, even though Jews wanted to stay in Iraq. And so you have a smaller Zionist movement in Iraq, which is completely illegal. So this is one account of a young woman called Violet, who writes that she thought that every Jew is selfish, every Jew is think only about his or herself, until her brethren from Palestine, from the land of Israel, came to show her the way. And this group, very much like the communists, very much like the socialists, recognize that the Iraqi Jewish youth are frustrated by the situation. They want gender equality. They're troubled by the conservatism of certain elements in Iraqi society. They want a radical solution, and they offer one. Here is another from Margalit, who's a young Jewish Iraqi who left and moved to Israel. And she writes to her parents, and you can see the letter at the back. She's saying to them, you know, I heard that you're going to go and migrate to the United States. Why are you doing this? You know, we thought that every place where a Jew go, a Jew is persecuted. Don't go to the United States. You think that the Americans are civilized? Well, the people thought about the Germans as civilized too. And so you have this small movement. It's not very important, but it's very much appeals to young Jews. And in addition to that, you have quite an active communist movement, also illegal, where youth who are very much loyal to Iraq, who don't want to leave, who are sort of very, very committed to the Iraqi project. You have the communist movement, young Jews join, and this is also not very much favored by the state. And so in the quote behind me, there's a story about a young Jewish girl who joins the communist movement. She tells actually the police investigator that she joins because she wants to get social justice, because her family members convinced her. And so you have this two kind of illegal movement, and you have sort of a large middle-class Jewish community, including also upper middle class with Jewish millionaires and very rich Jewish communities, including also lower middle-class Jews who are quite happy with their lives in Iraq. Who are integrated into the community. You also have a community in the north that speaks the dialect of Aramaic and integrates more with the Kurdish community. But after the 1948 war, it's becoming really impossible for them to stay. Again, with the pressures from Israel to send them back, with a right-wing campaign against them in the Iraqi press by some members of the Iraqi government, and so they leave. They live in droves. They are not even getting passports. They're getting some laissez-passer, which lets them go only to Israel. And they arrive to Israel in, again, the year 1949 to 1951. So imagine the situation now going to Israel. You have a state that is established in 1948. 1% of the population was killed during the 1948 war. You have communities of Jews coming to Israel from all over the world. The state triples its population during the 1950s. And the state has exactly zero resources to absorb all these Jewish communities. There's no housing. There are no appropriate places to educate them. There are no financial means. Now, the Iraqi community, the Iraqi Jewish community, lost all of its property. It was frozen by the Iraqi state. They couldn't get much out. This is happening while other disenfranchised communities come. The Holocaust survivors, who obviously have very little. Jews from Egypt who also lost all their property. So we're talking about a situation where, the country is flooded with people. The state of Israel demanded that each and every Jew will come there, but there are no financial resources to absorb them. So the situation, especially in 41 and 51, is quite horrible. And the solution that the state finds for this situation is to build ma'abarot, transit camps, which means that the state puts all these newcomers, all these olim, all these immigrants in what we would call today refugee camps. But the state at the time didn't want to call them refugee camps because these were not refugees. These were sons returning to their homeland in the state's ideology. So what they did in these transit camps is build these camps usually next to cities, usually over the ruins of depopulated Palestinian villages, so to keep the indigenous population from coming back. And they settle all these migrants, including the Iraqi communities, in these transit camps that were initially camps made of tents, and later on the tents were replaced by wooden shacks and houses made of tin and aluminium. the Iraqi Jews, this was a complete and utter, you know, devastating moment, because these are folks that used to live in houses, these are folks who used to have day jobs. All of a sudden they have nothing, and they're dependent on a state that is quite poor. So first of all, there was the question of the social status. You know, you were one day a merchant and the next day you were a penniless worker. The second thing was ideological. So the state really believed that you have to suffer for your sake. The founders sort of said to the newcomers, if they complained repeatedly, and you find this in documents, well, we suffer too when we came to mandatory Palestine or Ottoman Palestine. We also live in tents, so now it's your turn to live in tents. The state pushed people to work in, you know, work project and pay them daily wages based on their work in construction or in agriculture. For many people, that was a humiliating experience. They were middle-class merchants and bureaucrats. They did not want to be socialist farmers and work the land, or socialist construction workers. But there were even more problems that had to do with the living conditions of these communities there. Now, I'm talking about the Iraqis, but remember that we're also talking about these transit camps that populated Jews from Eastern Europe, from Romania, from Yugoslavia, from all over the world. So one was the situation of housing, living in tents. Education was very poor. Kids studied in tents and in shacks, and the level was quite bad. These transit camps, although they were close to big cities, they were quite isolated. So you didn't have buses leading people to them. You didn't have buses taking people to work. You didn't have, you know, proper transportation. Water supply was quite scarce. So there were showers, but they were few in numbers. The hygiene conditions, the sanitary conditions were very bad. There were reports about mice and rats and you know, other things that endangered the health of the people who lived there. The other thing that was important was the weather. It was very warm in the summer in houses made of tin. When it was raining, when people lived in tents, you know, it was extremely difficult to survive. So people will think about, you know, 1948, especially with relation to the Jewish communities, obviously not with relationship to the Palestinian community, as this kind of this happy moment, you know, the state is established, all the problems are solved. But actually, if you look at Israel in the 1950s, it's quite a struggle to populate all these migrants that come to the state. So these are a few images of these transit camps. You can see here the tents initially. You can see people hung laundry to dry between the tents. These are the houses that were made of tin. Again, people, when you read the accounts of the folks who came, you see accounts of devastation, of shock. People thought that they were going to come and live in houses in Tel Aviv or in Jaffa, and all of a sudden they needed to live in these tents and shacks. Now, for Iraqi Jews, as well as for many other Jews who came from Middle Eastern countries, there was also the cultural element. There was also the racism that was addressed to them by the more established European communities that did not know how to handle Jew and how to respect or how to respond to Jews who spoke the language of the Arab enemy, right? These Jews liked Arabic. They liked the Arabic language, they liked music, they liked Arab food. And they were Jewish, but at the same time, they were proud of the Arab cultural heritage. And so we have a lot of expressions of trying to figure out who these Jews are. A lot of taxonomies in state documents. Who's better, Egyptian Jews or Yemenite Jews or Bulgarian Jews or Polish Jews or Romanian Jews? So you have these taxonomies. At the back here you see an article that was actually denounced by David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, that speaks about Jews from North Africa. And it talks about, you know, how these guys are similar to Berbers and to Negroes, and they have no talent, and they don't know how to produce anything intellectual. Now again, this is about the North Africans, but we do have state documents that speak about other Jewish communities in this fashion. We also find this in letters that Iraqi Jews themselves publish. So this is a letter written by an Iraqi Jew who was in the kibbutz. And he sort of talks about the fact that people call Iraqi Jews Arabs, ignorant, black. They ask them if they eat with a knife and fork. And so you have in this letter that is published there a few important things. One is that for these folks now, Arab is synonymous with black, and with ignorant, and that these are all very bad things. And the second thing is the complete ignorance of folks around them about their lifestyle. And you find this also in even pranks that Iraqi kids played. So there's a very famous activist from Iraq who later on became a minister in Israel called Shoshana Arbeli al-Muslimo. And she recalls that when she came to her kibbutz called Sde Nachum, people asked her and fellow Iraqis, oh, did you guys know what electricity is in Iraq? Did you ride camels in the street? And at one point they got so fed up with that they started telling people, yes, you know, in Iraq we had cannibals and they cooked people in pots and all these kinds of things. And people were like, really? And where are these cannibals and where can we get them? So you know, this is one example, but people didn't know the difference, and they also didn't know the differences between different Jewish communities in the Middle East. They didn't necessarily know that, you know, Jews from Tunisia spoke a dialect that was incomprehensible to Iraqi Jews. These communities were also referred to by the derogatory name Schwarzes, a derogatory name for blacks. So they're dealing with horrible social conditions. They're completely dependent on the state. And in that they actually share the fate with Holocaust survivors, with other Jews from Europe, but at the same time, they also are marked in particular because their culture is deemed primitive and unmodern. So these are again some images of children from these transit camps. And children at the time had unique problems. So there were no ambulances in these transit camps, so it took them a long time to arrive, and some women gave birth in the transit camps. We also have cases of miscarriages. There were even no places to put the babies, so sometimes we read accounts of officials who write about babies in boxes and in sacks to put them to sleep. Later on, the education system and the health system are not very developed, and the country itself in general was under austerity measures. So people got food based on rations and food stamps. This was for the entire Israeli population. And in these transit camps, because they were oftentimes not connected to the electricity grid, people got powders. So they got milk powder, they got eggs powder, and so the nutrition levels themselves were quite low. Then you also had issues with young adults. So we have the phenomenon of child and teenage labor, because these the regulations that sort of set very strict rules about teenage laborers were actually legislated in 1954. So that's an issue. You also had cultural problems, because as the children learn more and more Hebrew, and that they were ashamed of their parents who spoke Arabic. Now we also have similar accounts of kids who are ashamed that their parents speak Romanian or Yiddish or any other language that is associated with the language of the exile. But this is definitely true to Arabic. Some of the solution came where kids were sent to kibbutzim, to the socialist agricultural communities in Israel, but there too kids met challenges. they came from houses that were Masultim, where religious was practiced, and all of a sudden they moved to a socialist community where people celebrate Passover by eating bread and talking about the Hebrew slaves fighting against the capitalist Egyptian regime. So they had to adjust to quite a lot. The biggest shock was to see their parents fall from grace. And children are naive, so they don't understand the meaning of the transformation. And in many autobiographies, they confess that they were asking, why are we here? Why are we not back in our houses in Amara or Baghdad or Hilla or any of these places? So Shoshana Levi, who was an Iraqi girl, wrote a memoir describing her memoir how her parents lived in Iraq. In a house, and all of a sudden they were dumped in a transit camp, and she's saying, like, my parents now live as the beggars who used to beg for food in our houses in Baghdad. So the state has to deal with that with not too many financial means, and so it sends guides and teachers and social workers to work in these transit camps. Some of it is quite helpful, especially the youth guides, but some of it is also perceived by the newcomers as condescending, because they now live in poverty, because they have no property, and because they have to live in these transit camps. But for some of the guides who came from the state, they believed that the poverty and the neglect were actually a result of coming from an Arab country. So there were a lot of clashes, but especially for the young generations, the guides from youth movements, the teachers, the people who played with them played a very important role. Now, another problem that occurs in the 1950s, especially in the winters of 1949, 1950, 1950, 1951, is very harsh weather conditions. So at that point, there's snow in Israel, and people are very happy. Those who live in houses, there is snow, that's not regular. But for people living in tents and shacks, this is completely devastating. And so what the state does is a whole operation of taking the children away from their families. They don't want to take families together from the transit camps because they're afraid that they will not come back. So children were taken separately and being sent to other families in Israel, spent there the winter period, and then came back. But in the transit camps themselves, there was a whole atmosphere of rioting and great concern as tents and shacks crumbled. And so most mothers agreed to send their children away. Some mothers also protested. So the story behind me is a story that was written by Esperance Cohen, who later on became a journalist. And she writes that two women who were social workers came to her and said, give us your two children, we'll send them away. And she's like, my children will die of hunger, but I will not send them anywhere else. So then she's describing how she tried very hard to get them something. She got them she looked at the garden. She found an empty sardine box. In the box, she filled it out with hot chocolate. And if you read the story of Esperance Cohen, most of it is kind of trying to have her kids survive these conditions. She was successful. One of her kids is a NASA engineer, another became a doctor, but these very harsh moments are really the moments that shaped her life. But the establishment had difficulties understanding what was happening. So when parents refused to give their children away, or when parents refused their tents because they were hoping that the tents would crumble and they would maybe get a house, the state officials like Giora Yoseftal, who was in charge of the Jewish Agency, the major body in the state that took care of newcomers, they were interpreting this as fatalism, as lack of organized life. So this again was something that the newcomers had to deal with. The responses were quite swift. So you have all throughout the 1950s a series of demonstrations in Israel, not just by Iraqis, by a whole group of people, whether it's sailors, that demanded better conditions, whether it's people, especially in the mid-1950s, objecting to the recreation with Germany. So it's a culture of demonstration, and they definitely take part of it. And there's a whole series of demonstrations, sit-ins, people bringing Torah scrolls in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Haifa, in front of the Jewish Agency, of folks demanding housing, of folks demanding to move to permanent housing, of folks demanding education and water and better services, and Iraqis play a role in these demonstrations. Some Iraqis also squat to property. Again, if we talk about this period more generally, this is a period of people protesting. This is a period of great unhappiness. Now, at the same time, at the end of the day, this Iraqi Jews integrated into Israeli society. And they considered themselves Israelis. Part of it was the second generation, part of it was the notion that they were saved by the state. The Hebrew education helped a lot. But what I'm curious is, and what I wrote about in my book, is what kind of an identity emerged there. Like, what is the identity of people who come to Israel and witness all this suffering? People who had connections to Iraq, who missed Iraq, but at the same time decided that they're Israelis and even Israeli patriots. So what kind of identities developed in this context? So in the early years, you find a lot of complaints by Iraqi Jews about the fact that they don't find much in common with the other Jewish communities. In the account behind you, which is common, this guy says, like, I came to Israel, I didn't understand how German Jews don't get along with Iraqi Jews and how Russian Jews don't get along with other Jewish communities. And so this idea that there are all these types of Jews, and they don't necessarily get along with one another, and issues of color are important, was quite significant. But as the state sort of says, you know, these are folks that are from the Middle East, they all share the same culture, Iraqi Jews had other ideas. They were like, well, we don't necessarily have a lot in common with, you know, Yemenite Jews. And in fact, when Iraqi Jews came to Israel, those who had French could converse, for example, with Jews from Romania who also had French, or Jews from North Africa who had French. Those who knew English could converse with other folks who knew English. So sometimes, because a lot of Iraqi Jews went to British schools or schools where English was important. So by British schools, I mean bilingual Hebrew English, Arabic English school. But in any case, they had these languages, they had some things in common with other people, but they felt that they were lumped together with Jews from other communities in the Middle East. So in response to that, I think that actually three forms of nostalgia, three forms of longing and belonging actually emerged in this period. So the first one was actually longing to Iraq. People who lived in, you know, isolated transit camps together with other Iraqis started missing Iraq and sort of saying Iraq was the best country, we wish we could go back. So in the early years, there was almost a shift. Iraq became the lost paradise. Baghdad became kind of the place where people wanted to live. So there's a quote that I really like from a woman that was later called Tikva Agassi, and at the time her name was Amal Saleh. And she says, you know, I know that God chose Jerusalem to be the best city in the world, and I love Jerusalem. But she says, I really think that Aram Naharaim, which is the name for Mesopotamia, was a better choice. Like, I really, it's too bad that we didn't stay in Iraq, that God didn't choose Iraq as, you know, our paradise. And, you know, this woman was a law student in Baghdad. She came from a very rich family. There was a senator, an Iraqi senator in her family, a famous rabbi. And later when she comes to Israel, she struggles. She first works as a teacher. She lives herself in a shack. So it actually makes sense that she misses Iraq that much. There's a very important writer in Arabic called Samir Naqash, who died a few years ago. Samir Naqash wrote in Arabic until the day he died. He only published in Arabic. And if you look at his stories, it's all about Baghdad. He even reconstructs the Jewish Iraqi dialect. So it's kind of these stories that are frozen in time, and stories that were written in the Israeli city of Petah Tikva, but spoke to a whole community that was very, very different than the community of Petah Tikva. The other issue, so at first you have Iraqi identity, and this identity, by the way, is still alive and well today, even with the second and third generation. There's a whole website on Facebook called Preserving the Iraqi Language that if you go there, you can become friends if you want. They show you Iraqi recipes in the Iraqi dialect and Iraqi jokes, so it's still around. There's also a museum in Israel called the Museum of Babylonian Jewry that has a library that tells you the history of the Jewish community in Iraq. You have nights of Iraqi music, Iraqi food. So the Iraqi identity, well, today is very different because it's not forged in transit camps and in slums, is still quite strong. But in addition to that, you also had the Arab identity, right? The ability to read Arabic, the ability to pick up any book in Arabic and understand what it is, the listening to Egyptian singer like Kulthum and enjoying her music. And initially that was problematic. So Nushat Qassab, who later on again became a very important politician, parliament member, talks about the fact that when she arrived to Israel in 1949, she met her sister and her brother-in-law, and she talked to her sister in Arabic, and the sister had a kid, and she wanted to go to this kid and hug him and tell him how much she missed him, but she spoke in Arabic, so the kid looked at her with disdain, and when she asked her brother-in-law what's going on, he said, look, you speak Arabic, and we just came out of a war. So it was difficult for her to convince her own nephew that she wasn't the enemy because she spoke the language of the enemy. So how do you deal with that? The Arab identity of these newcomers paradoxically separated them from the state, but also brought them together to the state. So in this period, you have Jews who are quite radical. And some of the folks who were communist in Iraq and some folks who were not communist in Iraq actually joined the Communist Party in Israel. Now at that time, this is a party that is a-Zionist, often anti-Zionist, and it's an Arab Jewish party. And according to some accounts, in the transit camps, although this party was a national pariah, the state put a lot of pressure against it, the Communist Party won 20% of support or of the votes in some of these transit camps. So we're talking about, again, a party that is extremely unpopular in the eyes of the establishment, but for young radicals who know Arabic, this party offers quite a lot because they have newspapers in Arabic where they can publish, they have activists in the party, activists that are willing to work on behalf of Jews from Arab countries. And so you have Jews joining them. And Jews who speak Arabic. This is an example from Sami Michael, and he says, when I talked Arabic in Israel, people thought I was some kind of an enemy. I thought I was a stranger. And Sami Michael's whole life project was actually to try to explain that the people in Iraq were not his enemies, that the people in Iraq were his friends. Now today Sami Michael is a novelist that writes in Hebrew, and he's quite a famous novelist, but in the early 1950s he was quite a radical communist, writing for the party's newspaper, Al-Ittihad. Now, the party leadership, the Palestinian leadership of the party, also sensed that there was another alternative for Iraqi Jews, an alternative that today becomes very popular to most Jews from Middle Eastern countries, and that's actually identifying with the Israeli right. At that time, it was a party called Chirut. Today, we know it by the name of Likud. And that party was actually quite committed to the issue, to the sufferings of people in the transit camp, and they also hoped to enlist their support. There was, in 1951, there was a demonstration in Haifa after Jews were executed from Iraq. And that demonstration was organized by Chirut, and in this demonstration, Iraqi Jews said, we want for every Jew executed in Iraq, 2 Palestinians executed in Israel, and we want their property given to Iraqi Jews. And Amir Habibi, a Palestinian, a Christian, the leader of the Communist Party, actually addresses them, and so one of the leaders actually addresses them and says, don't be like that. Like, you were victims of racism in Iraq. Don't be racist in Israel. We will fight side by side with you. So Jews join. The person behind me used to be my Arabic teacher at Tel Aviv University. And in 1950, and he was a Jew by the name of Sasson Somech. He was educated in Baghdad, knew Arabic quite well. And in 1954, he writes a letter, again, to the cultural journal of the Communist Party called Al Jadid, that says, me and my friends, we were writing in Arabic, we want to continue writing in Arabic, please give us the opportunity to do so. And he is accepted. The poem behind me is a poem written by an Iraqi radical in the 1950s about sort of his struggle, saying that the Communist Party in Israel and the Communist Party in Iraq are brothers and sisters, and they all should strive together to fight against oppression. So he wrote, this Iraqi poet wrote the poem in Arabic. Sasson Somech translated into Hebrew, and that poem was circulated in Israel in pamphlets. On that level, the Arabic actually became a bridge with the Palestinian population, especially for this radical generation. And they write in the party's journals, they have demonstrations that are organized by the Communist Party. The communist journals report about the sufferings of Iraqi Jews, and so this is quite significant. But at the same time, the Arabic of the newcomers actually tied them to the state. So in the 1950s, these newcomers, these Iraqi Jews, had very little to give political parties in Israel. But there was one thing that they could do, because they were citizens, and that is to vote. So every party had a newspaper that was addressed to Jews from the Middle East in Arabic, trying to convince these Jews to vote, including the ruling Labor Zionist Party, including other parties. Chirut, the right-wing party, had a journal called Al-Hurriya, Liberty. Mapam, which was a socialist party to the left of the ruling party, had a newspaper in Arabic called Al-Mirsad. The Liberal Party had a journal called Nashat al-Akhbar. All of these venues are actually populated by Iraqi Jews who write there, who are very active there. Then there's a question of the Palestinian population. So the Palestinian populations, those Palestinians who stayed in Israel and became Israeli citizens, had to study. Now, what do you teach them? And what do you teach them about history? Do you teach them about Jewish history? How do you make sure that they're not radicalized? And we have accounts from this period about, Palestinian kids who are saying Ben Gurion is not our leader, Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was the Egyptian leader at the time, is our real leader. And so Iraqi Jews are sent as teachers to teach in Palestinian schools, and they operate as a very important kind of middleman between the state and the schools. And they also teach Arabic in Jewish schools. So a few years ago, I went to an event where a very famous Israeli playwright that usually speaks in a German accent, a little bit of a German accent. His Hebrew's perfect, but anyways, he mentioned something about that he knew a little bit of Arabic from school. And I asked him, like, I mean, someone in the audience asked him, well, what do you know? And then he started quoting, like, complete sentences about the Soviet Union. So it turns out that his teacher was an Iraqi Jew. He was a communist. He taught them Arabic from the newspaper of the Communist Party. So this guy was like, yeah, the Soviet Union. So, you know, that happened too. But this is more of a rarity, but you do have people teaching. The second issue was the security services. So at that time, again, Israel was trying to develop its own security services. This is where Shin Bet is established. This is where Mossad is established. Very few people actually agreed to spy on behalf of Israel in other Arab countries, and the security services actually absorbs Iraqi Jews. And if you look, they are the ones who are very active in establishing the dictionaries, in teaching the dialect, since 1948 onwards, and they continue doing so. And here my intervention in the scholarship is that the emphasis has always been on the radical Jews, the ones that are, are pro-Palestinian, and their history is quite important, and I write a lot about them. But it's also interesting to note how the state kind of offered this kind of package deal to the new immigrants, and sort of saying, like, if you serve the state, then your Arabic is actually useful. It's not a marker of primitive culture, it's actually something that the state could capitalize on. So the security service is quite important. Then there was also propaganda. So at that time, especially in the 1950s, there's a whole a sort of propaganda campaign from Arab countries, sort of denouncing Zionism, denouncing the Israeli project, and so on. And it's quite popular, and it's also a very interesting mix of, singing and music and sketches, and at the same time also, political messages. And there are complaints by Israeli officials that if you go to the transit camps where Jews live, you hear, the voice of Fairuz from Lebanon, or you hear Kalsoum. And so Israel decides to build its own radio station, and to have its own sketches and its own songs designed for the Arabs in Israel, to the Palestinians, but also to whoever hears it outside of Israel. And Iraqi Jews and Egyptian Jews played a very important role in this venue. Now, in addition to that, you also had an orchestra of the Arabic radio station that belonged to Israel, and that orchestra was actually made of, again, Iraqi and Egyptian Jews who were very, very prominent singers and musicians in their home countries. Iraqi Jews in Iraq were very notable musicians. They wrote a lot of sort of the hits on Iraqi radio. They wrote very well-known songs. In Israel, the kanun players, the oud players, they had nothing to do, and so they're drawn to this orchestra that becomes quite important. And so they get a role in the station in Israel, both as screenwriters, so this is one example, and as security people. Now, these are, when we're talking about, the number of people who are engaged in these projects, in the security services, and as teachers, these are actually smaller numbers. Most people actually either perished economically, or they managed to struggle, use the social capital that they had in Iraq if they were trained as doctors or as accountants, and kind of use the same training that they had under the British mandate to find a position in Israel. But some actually use these venues, either spying in other Arab countries, surveilling the Palestinian population, developing connections with the Kurds in northern Iraq. That was a very important project of Israel, especially after 1963. So Sami Michael, the communist that I mentioned before, talks about the fact that he was approached by people and sort of said, you know, oh, you should go, we shall send you back to Iraq and you will be, you know, you will be in prison, and then in prison you will make contacts with the Kurds. And he was like, you guys are crazy, I'm never going back to Iraq. But other people were, and in fact his brother-in-law was a man by the name of Eli Cohen, who was a Syrian Jew, who was a very famous spy in Damascus and was later on executed in Syria. But at the same time, these venues that were essentially meant to be propaganda venues, especially the orchestra and the broadcasting station in Israel, actually became much more than propaganda tools, because they, unlike the press, people can imbue them with their own desires, with their own dreams. People actually could talk about how they felt, they could express the culture that they like. So you have this identity, which is Arab, both in the service of the state or against the state. But you also have another identity that begins to be formed, and that's something that is called in Hebrew Mizrahi identity. It literally means the Jews of the East. The communities were called at the time Adot HaMizrach, the communities of the East. And you get the realization that Iraqi Jews sense, after staying in Israel for a little while, that actually the way they're treated is not just because they're from Iraq, but they also have some things in common with Jews from Morocco or Yemen. They might have not have a lot in common with them way back before they came to Israel, but now they have something in common because they're all labeled as Mizrahim, as Jews from the East. This was especially true in the late 1950s, in 1951, I believe, where you had riots of North African Jews in Haifa, in the quarter called, or in a neighborhood called Wadi Salim, that was previously a Palestinian neighborhood, and was a slum populated by Moroccan Jews. And they demonstrate, they paralyze Haifa for 3 days. There were also demonstrations in Beersheba. And so some Iraqis, including Victor Muallim, who was a very important teacher, pedagogue in Iraq, and later on a teacher in Israel, writes that, you know, this is not just about violence. This is, you know, something that has to do with discrimination of all Jews from Middle Eastern countries in Israel. So he's Iraqi, but he writes about Moroccans. Then we also have letters, again, of Iraqi Jews themselves. So this is a letter that was written by a kid from a kibbutz, who are sort of saying, you know, we notice that Jews from Middle Eastern countries are discriminated against. We get less housing. When these transit camps were finally dissolved in the late 1950s, early 1960s, you know, we sense that the European Jews leave early. So the idea is we have something in common with other people who are like us from the Middle East, so we skip that. Now, you know, these transit camps are eventually dissolved. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, some people managed to get away from these cycles of poverty, other people do not. In many cases, there are slums built close to the transit camps where some people are sent to which some people are sent. But this story is actually something that is quite important in today's Israel. The Labour Party, the socialist Zionist party that was in charge of the integration, if we can call it like that, of Iraqi Jews into Israeli society, was in power until 1977. At that time, the right, Chirut, that later on becomes Likud, addresses various communities in Israel. Its platform is right-wing, but it's also against corruption, and it's also about attending to the pleas of Middle Eastern Jews. And sort of saying like, the right will take care of you. We're not socialist. These activities had roots already in the 1950s. But they play a very important role in the electoral campaign of 1977. And these issues, these questions, today in a very neoliberal age, in an age where the right has been in power since 1977, almost uninterruptedly, these questions are still very important. And they're explored in documentaries. They're highly politicized. The question of how many Mizrahi candidates each party has, the question of how do you deal with the history of Israel in the 1950s, is something that troubles Israeli society until today. Even these questions of socioeconomic gaps: are they closed down? Are they not closed down? Do Iraqis have a lot in common with Jews from Morocco? How do you think about the culture? How do you think about the Arab culture? What is the relationship to the Palestinians? Is the relationship to Palestinians? What is the relationship to Iraq? What is the relationship to other Arab countries? So these questions and this very troubled past are still part of the fabric of Israeli society. Now, this is the cover of the book I published on this topic, and it's not just a plug, although shamelessly it is. But the kid there is a friend of mine who passed away. His name was Ovadia Ezra. He was a philosophy professor. His family migrated from Baghdad, actually from Basra to Israel. They lived in poverty, and his mother was a widow, and she sent a few of her kids to live in a kibbutz. So this is his older brother who's in the kibbutz, and he's visiting him. He carries him on his shoulders, and for me that was something that I wanted to capture in terms of it has. I mean, the photo has many stories that I wanted to tell about mutual help, about the shift to work in agriculture, but also there's something deceptive about this photo. If I showed you this, you would sort of say, well, these are probably Israeli pioneers and they're working the land. You wouldn't know that behind this photo there's a story of poverty and disillusion and violence. You don't know that behind his brother who's trying to help his baby brother, there's a mother from Basra who's trying to get food for her kids. So in a way, that is part of the project that I'm trying to explore. And I thank you very much for your attention and exploring it with me. Thank you very much.